The command line interface is extremely powerful. It allows you to have full interaction with the computer operating system using just text-based commands. And this enables a really efficient and flexible control over various tasks and operations. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like comparing driving a manual car versus an automatic car, because it requires more direct control and precision. And this allows users to fine-tune and customize their actions. Whereas a GUI, very similarly to an automatic car, where it's providing you with a more user-friendly and automated experience, but at the cost of a lot less granular control over the underlying processes. And just like manual transmission, you're not really going to get it until you use it and you get a feel for it. And that's really how the command line is. You can be told about it, told all the various different commands and ways to interact with the operating system, but once you start using it is when you're really going to understand what's going on. So let's get to it. With our terminal open, let's run the first command called who am I. As you can see after hitting enter that the terminal gives us an output, and that happens to be our user account name. Notice how the Ubuntu name is also in green, and that's because this section that's right before the $ over here, all in green, is the appearance of the prompt. The prompt is where we are entering commands like who am I, and this section is highly customizable. We can pull data and various information from the system, very much like how the proc folder had meminfo and CPU info and such. We can pull stored information like Ubuntu, which is our user account name, and put that inside of the prompt so that we can always get a sense of who is the current user on this given prompt at this given time. So ultimately, that is to say that this terminal right now that I'm running and this prompt is currently in operation by the Ubuntu user at the IP address of 10.10.06. So now if we ran the groups command, this is the output for this current user Ubuntu. And we can see these are all the various groups that this Ubuntu user belongs to. Dialouts, CD-ROM, sudo, and a lot of others. And we're going to come back to sudo. That's a really important one. And now let's look at the ID command. The output from running ID gives us our current user ID, that UID value, and that's where we saw inside the logs before, is that current ID value 1000 is for the Ubuntu user, and that's how the logs had actually recorded it when Text Manager was being opened. It was being recorded by that user ID, and that's representative of Ubuntu. And then we have group ID and other types of IDs that this user is related to. Now note that these numbers actually have meaning. It's not like they were just assigned random values. We can see that user ID of 1000 and the group ID of 1000, that's a common naming convention for the first user account on the system that you as a regular person can access. All these other numbers underneath, these lower numbers, are typically system or service or special privileged accounts. So now let's look at the pwd command. And this one is for print working directory. That output there of /home/Ubuntu is where this terminal is currently being accessed on disk. This is the current location of the prompt. So to recap, all of the commands that we run by default are currently in relation to the current username, which is Ubuntu. And if we don't specify anything any further, and any of the commands are in reference to a file or folder, it will then try to run those commands from the current working directory, which in this case is /home/Ubuntu. So let's demonstrate that with the ls command. The ls command is to list out the current files and folders of the current directory. So in this case, if I hit enter right now, we're going to see the output of /home/Ubuntu. So we can see here that we have some folders and we have a wallpaper as well. Now make sure that you take your time with this stuff and maybe replay that section a little bit a couple more times, because the most difficult thing when you first start working on the terminal, especially in Linux, is trying to get a sense of where you're currently at, who you currently are, what you're currently trying to do. So if you can orient yourself around that and try to keep that in the forefront of your thinking at all times, it's just going to make everything else easier to understand and work with. And for example, what if we wanted to now change our current working directory? We can do that with the cd command for change directory. And if we just run cd desktop as it is, and that's to say without hitting enter, then what we should try to anticipate is that because we haven't specified any other location, if we try to just write cd desktop, it's going to try to change the current directory to the desktop directory that is within this current working folder. And now notice that the prompt has changed. It's actually letting us know that we're working out from that desktop directory. Okay, so that's an introduction to some working commands to get an idea of who we are and such. Now the terminal can get cluttered pretty quickly. So another important command to know is the clear command. And clear just clears the current view of the terminal. Note that if I run the whoami command again, it hasn't changed anything there. So just keep that in mind. It's just the terminal view that we're clearing. So now let's run an ls command again inside of desktop, just to show that we're actually inside of there. There's nothing inside of that folder as expected. Okay, so let's try to change the current working directory to another location. And let's say we wanted to go back up, go back inside of /home/Ubuntu. We can do that by just hitting ... And ... is representative of going back up one folder. So if we run pwd again, we can see that we're actually back at /home/Ubuntu. So now we're running commands in the terminal. It actually isn't that bad, right? And you're still following my guide, my prompt over here. So what I want to introduce you to is the man command. And the man command is essentially a command to run to display the manual pages, or sometimes called the man pages, of a given command. So if I wanted to run something like man ls, that'll give us the manual pages for the ls command. And now the Linux man pages for commands are actually really well documented. And they give you just enough information to understand what the command is supposed to do, how you can format it, so like how you can actually run it, and what other types of options you can run it with. And we're going to get to that shortly. So if you're ever in doubt and you want to look something up on the command line and see what it does, you can just run the man command and then the command after it to understand what it actually is supposed to do. To exit the man pages, we just have to hit the Q key as represented on the bottom, highlighted in that white banner. And now the man pages are great, but sometimes we just need a quick reference of what the command is. That's where the what is command comes into play. So we can type something like what is and then ls, and it'll just briefly tell us what the current command is trying to do. See, it's not so bad once you start working with it. So let me show you another tool now inside of the Firefox browser actually. It's a website, and it's called explainshell.com. And sometimes we just want to be able to grab a long chain of commands and get an idea of what they do, and that's what explainshell.com is for. You can go inside of this website and then just put in the command that you're looking for, and it's going to do its best attempt to describe for you what the commands are trying to do. So let's try that with the pwd command now. And once we hit enter, it's kind of like giving us that brief what is view of the command. In this case, it tells us print name of the current working directory. And it's actually pulling this information from the man pages. If we click on that pwd at the bottom, it's going to take us to the manpages.ubuntu.com documentation. And this is actually just the man pages. So sometimes this is a little bit easier for beginners to work with, to put their commands inside of here and get that web app view that you might be used to with the GUI instead of on the command line until you're more comfortable with it. And that's it for this lab as a little intro to the command line and orienting yourself around it. We'll continue with each lab from here on and progress a little bit more with complexity and introduce you to more tools.